Welcome to Pod Save America. I'm Jon Favreau.
I'm Jon Lovett.
I'm Tommy Vietor.
On today's pod, Tommy talks with LA District Attorney candidate George Gascon about what progressive criminal justice reform looks like. Before that, we'll talk about what kind of progress on police reform might come from these protests, the establishment Republicans and military leaders who are abandoning Donald Trump, and how Friday's surprising jobs report might affect the 2020 campaign. All right, let's get to the news. For the second weekend in a row, protesters took to the streets of big cities and small towns across America and around the world in a massive demonstration against police brutality and systemic racism. There are over 10,000 people in cities like Washington and Los Angeles. This weekend's protests were met with a much smaller and less militarized law enforcement presence. Curfews were lifted, and wouldn't you know, there was less violence and chaos. Trump spent the weekend angrily tweeting from inside the giant wall he had built around the White House, downplaying the size of the protests and lobbing insults at Joe Biden, Barack Obama, D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser, Bob Mueller, Colin Powell, and George Floyd, sharing a tweet which said the fact that he's been held up as a martyr is, quote, sickening. The next day, the White House said that the president may soon deliver a speech on race and unity, so tune in for that. So let's put Trump aside for a second because I do want to start by focusing on the protesters and activists who've led this movement. In what ways do you guys think they've already succeeded? Tommy, why don't we start with you?
Okay, so I think I think these protests have been overwhelmingly successful, and there's a bunch of different parts of that. So, I mean, a lot of people have woken up to the fact that police violence and brutality is rampant. You know, right? It's not just a few bad cops. It's not just a few bad police forces. I mean, you're seeing these videos of abuse from LA to New York to Buffalo, and it shocks the conscience. And I think that's woken a lot of folks up. You're also seeing protests everywhere. I mean, in 2014, it was focused on Ferguson. You're not just seeing protests in, majority African American cities. You're seeing people protesting in like tiny towns all across the country. They are, literally ubiquitous. And public sentiment is on the right side. The Wall Street Journal found that by 2-1 margin, voters are more troubled by police actions in killing George Floyd than they are about protest violence. And I think that's good because it's helping people dismiss bad faith arguments that pop up at these times, right? Like Colin Kaepernick's protest was pretty lonely. It was like him and Reed and a few others. But that discussion was quickly stolen from him and made about the anthem and disrespecting the flag or the U.S. military, despite the fact that the guy who told Kaepernick to kneel and not sit on the bench was a former Green Beret. It was like guidance from a service member. So this time it feels more focused. And then, lastly, it's like, I think the movement is broadening. It is a multiracial, multi-generational protest movement. We're seeing Republicans, like Mitt Romney was out there this weekend. The Republican district attorney in Franklin County, Pennsylvania, put out a statement saying Black Lives Matter. And he also said that he was specifically wrong to once reject that term and say all lives matter. So lawmakers moving. Mayor Garcetti here in LA announced a bunch of reforms. So it's been a dramatic shift in a short period of time.
Lovett, I don't think I've seen a shift this dramatic and quick in public opinion and public sentiment on any issue, maybe since sort of the gay marriage debate. I mean, just in the span of a couple weeks, seeing vast majority of Americans siding with protesters supporting Black Lives Matter, the Black Lives Matter movement, believing systemic racism and police brutality are serious, major problems, supporting major reforms to police departments. What other successes have you seen? What have your thoughts been watching this over the weekend?
Yeah, it is remarkable how quickly I think this has clarified the debate around police brutality, police accountability, and larger questions about systemic racism. It is true that there's been this sea change over the course of 2 weeks, but I do think it's worth saying that that really this is a culmination of a movement that was slowly gaining attention of Americans after each of these police killings that sort of
definitely
slowly over time began first with Black Lives Matter and now with this incredible outpouring grow, in part because at each step we've realized, something that, we've talked about on the show, that killings haven't decreased, that even some of these reforms haven't had the effect that they wanted them to, that sort of bigger systemic changes were needed. And I'll just say, for me, like just watching it unfold, I think that there are things that but in a lot of ways you don't internalize or they don't become central to how you think about politics. And what I found striking in just the past 2 weeks is how central the police are to conversations about a host of other issues, whether the police are the cause of or a symptom of these deeper problems, systemic racism, also our failure to take care of people with mental health and addiction issues, our failure to invest in schools and public parks and social welfare and social workers, and that what really is to me happening is we're having a very overdue conversation led by protesters who are fed up because police violence and police brutality are the tip of the spear.
Yeah, it's interesting listening to Pod Save the People last week. DeRay was saying that, when he first started caring about this issue and working on this issue, a lot of people said to him, why are you picking sort of police brutality? Isn't that sort of a niche issue in the context of larger criminal justice reform? And he said, well, like, when people end up in jail, end up in prison, end up stuck in the criminal justice system, how do you think they get there? An encounter with the police is almost always how someone enters the criminal justice system. And like so many movements, as you point out, Lovett, this was one that was started by a lot of activists and organizers who felt very lonely for a long time. And then there is a spark that makes it grow almost exponentially overnight. And now you see, some of the big protests on Friday were about this. It would have been Breonna Taylor's 27th birthday. And that was a case that when it happened, there were activists and organizers protesting, but it didn't sort of spark what we saw over the last couple of weeks. So these things build and build and build, and then suddenly something changes. There was also a lot of, I think, progress on the ground, tangible progress that we've seen over the last couple of weeks. I'll go from sort of small to bigger. There's officers who've been caught using excessive force are getting suspended, fired, investigated, and charged faster than they've been in the past. Cities have banned police from using chokeholds, tear gas, and other types of excessive force. LA and New York have announced they'll be redirecting some funding from police departments to job programs, healthcare, and other social services. Long-running movements to remove Confederate statues have finally forced action in places like Richmond, Virginia. And then on Sunday, and we'll talk about this in a second, the Minneapolis City Council announced that they'll be disbanding their current police force and basically rebuilding it from scratch over the next year.
I would just add, we should also add too that I do think it's worth pointing out that it's because of protests that charges were filed in the George Floyd case, that the Breonna Taylor case has been reopened. So there are there are clear signs that in really acute, directed ways, the protests are working while also starting this larger conversation around policy.
So let's talk about what comes next. In Congress, Democrats today introduced the Justice and Policing Act of 2020, which would require law enforcement agencies to report data on the use of force, create a national registry to track police misconduct, ban chokeholds, and mandate bias training. These reforms mirror much of what Joe Biden laid out over the weekend in an LA Times op-ed. He also called for a police oversight commission in his first 100 days, ending the transfer of weapons of war to local police, and a national use of force standard. Many activists have long believed that to truly end police violence, cities should consider defunding or disbanding their police forces altogether and replacing them with a new system of public safety, which, as we just mentioned, is exactly what a veto-proof majority of the Minneapolis City Council pledged to do on Sunday. Trump has already tweeted several times about how Joe Biden and the radical left Democrats want to defund the police, and even though that Biden hasn't proposed defunding, and in fact, he came out against defunding the police in a statement through his spokesman today. The Trump campaign and Republicans now want to use this as a wedge issue in the election. I kind of want to take this in two different parts. Let's get to the politics in a second. Let's just talk about sort of the substance of the argument around defunding or disbanding police forces. Tommy, you want to talk about that argument a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the conversation about defunding the police exists on a continuum, and there's different versions from different folks. But like at its essence, I think we are talking about dramatically rethinking how we approach public safety and emergency response. So that means evaluating the jobs you ask police to do, whether that work is effective, whether it's not, and then reallocating funds accordingly. So some data points that are relevant, like the Washington Post over the weekend reported a study that shows that there's no significant correlation between changes in state and local police spending and overall or violent crime rates. So given that, it does seem to make a lot of sense to rethink spending. And then part of this conversation is that departments have proven to just be ineffective, right? I mean, you just mentioned Minneapolis. In 2019, Minneapolis police only cleared 56% of cases where a person was killed. In 2018, their clearance rate for rape was just 22%. So this is a taxpayer-funded department that is not serving the community in any way. So should we talk about dramatically changing it? The other thing I think people are talking a lot about is the role of mental illness or disability and how those cases are responded to. So half of people killed by police have a disability or a mental health issue. Those calls should be answered by highly trained mental health professionals and not armed police. And then sort of more broadly, like if 5% of arrests in America are for violent crime, does it make sense for basically 100% of responders who are police officers to be heavily armed? Probably not. And so that's a piece of it. Part of it is that I think for a lot of communities in this country, they just believe that the institution of these police departments, they're just fundamentally broken. Like there's historians who compellingly argue that police forces were founded primarily to enforce racial segregation and not enforce laws. It was not about justice. And it is certainly true that for centuries in this country, African Americans could not turn to the police for justice in matters involving crimes committed by white people. In fact, they were often complicit in those crimes, the police were. And today, like the African American community has a fundamentally different relationship with the police than most white Americans do, right? I mean, I don't think any of the three of us were sat down by our parents to have a talk about how to interact with police if we're pulled over, because it's not a thing that is really discussed in white communities. So I think there are activists who are thinking like, this is a fundamentally broken, flawed institution at its core. We should think about how we reconstitute it to deal with the problems that police are supposed to respond to, but in a way that's more effective.
Lovett, you guys talked about this on your show. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think what Tommy said is right. You know, you step back and you say, all right, we closed asylums and mental hospitals because they were hellholes and mistreating people and abusive. And we replaced it with basically nothing. We didn't do anything to help people in the long run with mental illness. We didn't put the resources in it that were necessary. So it became a police problem. We have a rising homeless problem across the country. We don't put the resources in it that are necessary. We respond with police. The same about addiction and drug abuse. All the evidence is clear, right? That if someone has an addiction, if someone is struggling with drugs, that treatment and not punishment is the answer for them. Not only is it more effective, it's less expensive, it's more humane, and we don't do that. We respond with police. Why? Because over the course of 30 years, in part because of rising crime from the 60s into the 90s, in part because it was embraced not just by Republicans, but by Democrats, we shifted our resources towards police, and we sort of sucked the resources away from social services and all the rest. And so what we're in this situation where saying something that's obvious and true is seen as radical, right? Saying that we should reimagine what the police do, saying defund the police is radical when actually, when you dig into it, it's saying, here are the problems that police aren't solving. Here's what all the experts say we should do. Here's what our budgets actually look like. Can't we actually have an honest conversation about it? And it is seen as radical because these structures have been broken for so long, because the problems have been because these structures have been in place for so long, because the hierarchies are so entrenched, whether it's political, whether it's in terms of our government and the role police play in budgets and in local politics, and also in our culture. You know, there's no Law and Order Special Housing Unit, right? Our shows are about how tough and good cops are. Our shows are about how the police come in to solve all of our problems. And so I think what's interesting is you have the conversation being set by these protest movements, calling for something that sounds radical. When you dig into the actual questions that they're raising, the answers are actually not radical. They're honest and reflect the evidence. And what you will see over time, I think, is that these radical sounding solutions become more and more mainstream as Democratic politicians don't necessarily embrace the phrase defund the police, but embrace the larger vision of reimagining the role of police and reimagining the relationship between people and their government.
Yeah, I think before you get into slogans, you have to step back and ask, a couple larger questions, which is, what is the purpose of law enforcement? What do we want from law enforcement, right? We want a police force that doesn't commit violence, but stops violence. You want a police force that gives every citizen in the community equal protection under the law. We do not have that right now. We have not had that for a long time. So you look at the story of the Minneapolis Police Department. They have tried a number of reforms with this city council, with this mayor. They have tried trainings for bias and de-escalation. They have a diverse police department. They have body cameras. They have community policing. Every time they have tried further reforms, tried to redirect some proposed budget increases to fund a new Office of Violence Prevention, every time they've tried to do that, a lot of reforms have been blocked by the police department and their union. Steve Fletcher was one of the Minneapolis City Council members. He was writing this in Time Magazine this week. Police chief, who they think is a good reformer, has fired officers only to have his decisions overturned and those officers reinstated by arbitration. After they cut money from the police budget in Minneapolis, officers retaliated by not responding to 911 calls in certain wards of the Minneapolis City Council people who decided to vote to cut their budget. And so from the perspective of the Minneapolis City Council, you think, we've tried everything else. And the police department feels like they are unaccountable to the people they're supposed to serve. What else are we to do but at least try to stop the power of the police union from blocking these reforms? And there is a model for this, right? In Camden, New Jersey, which had the 5th highest murder rate in the nation, in 2013, the police department was disbanded by the city. It was restructured as a county police department. They actually had more officers at first throughout the county, but they had lower pay and benefits. They were trained to use handcuffs and handguns as a last resort. Not only body cameras, but they had GPS tracking devices on them. There was community policing, stricter use of force rules. And since then, reports of excessive force have dropped 95%, and violent crime is also way down in Camden. So they get both. They had less excessive force and less crime. They showed it's possible. Now, I think the tough part here is it is a very local issue because different cities and different police departments will need different reforms. So it's not like a one-size-fits-all thing. And you hear the Minneapolis City Council saying this too. They're like, we don't know what replaces it yet. We have to have these conversations with the community.
Right.
But at the very least, they're down that path, you know?
But I do think like it's the impunity that you described that has, I think, led this country to erupt at several times, right? Like now it's watching George Floyd be murdered. In 92, it was the cops who beat up Rodney King getting away with it. And when you step back and think about it, right, like Richard Nixon very famously said, well, when the president does it, that means it's not illegal. Trump has expressed similar sentiments. We all flip out about it. But that kind of impunity happens every day with police officers in a lot of communities. And like beyond, the brutality we've seen on videos, like nothing about arresting someone requires you to beat the shit out of them and grind their face into the concrete and smash their limbs with a baton. But yet we're watching police in Buffalo shove a 75-year-old man to the ground and do nothing as he starts to bleed out and then lie about what happened. Like if I can be charged with filing a false police report, where is the accountability when the park police brazenly lie to journalists about using tear gas on protesters? So I think part of this is like we give police so much leeway when it comes to using force and lethal force because it's a dangerous job. But we need to fix that. We need to right size that because what we're seeing is dramatic abuses of that power and people stepping up and saying this doesn't make sense. We should not tear gas citizens. We shouldn't shoot people with rubber bullets. Like we don't have to do that. It's making it worse.
Yeah, I mean, I do think too, a lot of what we're seeing is this is the unaccountability. This is the aggressiveness that wasn't a bug but a feature when this was put in place in many cases by a white majority that didn't ever have to fear that this would come for them. And what we're seeing on television is that kind of unaccountability, that aggressiveness taken as not a right, but what we are seeing is that aggressiveness that brutality taken as a part of the job, that is what it means for police to do their job, in part because of so long a culture that basically rewarded politicians, rewarded police chiefs, rewarded cities that invested in police and largely look the other way. Keith Ellison talked about this this morning on What a Day. He talked about the fact that it's not just that the rules meant that police weren't accountable. It meant there are also juries, grand juries, ordinary citizens who have been trained to just defer to the police, assume the police are telling the truth. But what we have seen, as Tommy pointed out over the past 2 weeks, is just how often that is irresponsible, just how often police are lying, even when caught on camera. And I think that is shocking to a lot of people, myself included, who haven't always been paying attention.
All right, so let's talk about the politics of this. We just spoke about sort of the rapid shift in public opinion in favor of protesters in favor of Black Lives Matter, in favor of systemic police reforms. No one so far has polled defund the police or polled abolish the police, but YouGov from last weekend decided to poll do you favor various police reforms, and banning chokeholds, body cameras, training to de-escalate conflicts all got like 70, 80, 90%, hugely popular. Then they said, do you support cutting funding to police departments? So just cutting funding. Only 16% of all voters said they support any cuts in funding for police departments. That includes 16% of Democrats, 21% of 18 to 29-year-olds, and 33% of Black Americans. So, I think for those of us who have been paying close attention to the protests, who've been reading a lot of these very thoughtful pieces about police reform over the last weeks, I think what we're saying, it makes sense. You can see why police need such sweeping reform. Of course, for a lot of Americans, and of course these numbers may change and probably will change, I imagine, over the coming weeks, but they're still pretty low. And you saw Biden come out today and say, he's not for defunding the police. And so far, no, a lot of elected Democrats, I saw Cory Booker, Karen Bass, a lot of the people who worked on this, Hakeem Jeffries, a lot of people who worked on the bill that they co-sponsored the bill that they introduced today, also said that they don't support defunding the police. And Republicans are out there saying Trump and the Republicans are salivating about using this as a wedge issue against Democrats. What do you think about the politics of this issue, Tommy?
Well, I mean, look, I don't know yet. I mean, so look, there's sort of like a near term. Let's talk about the politics of success or failure. So in the near term, like there's a big piece of this that's about the budget, because all these cities are going to deal with huge shortfalls thanks to the coronavirus. And you're seeing everywhere that every component, like agencies are getting gutted except for the police. And people are asking why. Like, why are we gutting school budgets and not police funding? So in LA, in April, Mayor Garcetti had proposed furloughs for 15,000 city employees, but not for the police. In fact, he'd offered to give them a 7% increase in spending for the LAPD. Since the protests have started, Garcetti has reversed course and said he will now direct $250 million to youth jobs, health initiatives, peace centers to heal trauma, and help those who are dealing with discrimination. That will be partly funded by $150 million that was previously allocated to the LAPD. That is like head-snapping political change for Los Angeles. Because in 1993, after the Rodney King riots, LA elected a Republican mayor who promised to hire 3,000 more cops to bring the force up to 10,000 officers, which is about where it is now. And so that's remarkable progress. Like, that's political success no matter how you measure it. I do think that, like, broadly, there's going to be an inside game and an outside game where activists who are marching and protesting are going to have to keep pushing people like Joe Biden to do more if they believe that's what's necessary. I also think there's a political imperative to more clearly define the policy and then tell a story about how that will make America like a better, safer world. And so, I don't think that we're immediately going to see Joe Biden say we should defund the police, but I do think like the amount of progress that's been made in even just the small amount of time since Ferguson in 2014 is incredible. And so 3 years from now, we might be having an entirely different conversation.
Lovett, what do you think?
Yeah, police budgets were sacrosanct. They're not going to be sacrosanct anymore. These are going to be. This is going to be a big part of the political fight, and I think that that's a victory. does remind me a bit of the debate around abolish ICE, in that activists and some candidates, but mostly activists, embrace this term abolish ICE. Democrats don't embrace the term. Republicans try to tar Democrats with the term anyway. And all the while, the conversation led because of this provocative and maximalist phrase leads to a debate about, well, what should these reforms look like? Well, it turns out, there are huge problems in ICE and huge reforms are needed. And maybe this department should be broken up in a certain way and its functions devolve to other agencies so it doesn't have this noxious, toxic culture. So I see the same thing playing out with Defund the Police in that, Kamala Harris, right? She and Cory Booker on the Senate side introduced this bill. She was asked by Meghan McCain, of course, this morning, or I assume it was this morning. She was asked by Meghan McCain this morning. The mayor of Minneapolis refused to say defund the police. I'm going to ask you the same question as protesters did. Do you support defunding police? And she didn't answer it yes or no. She explained why we need to reimagine the role of police in our lives, and she gave a pretty cogent answer. I don't know if it will satisfy activists ultimately, but it is so clear how much the conversation from the streets has trickled down into a much more progressive vision for what is possible in governing.
Yeah, 2 points for me on this. One, very much agreeing with what Tommy said, is I think sometimes we forget to separate the role of activists and politicians. Politicians will do what is broadly popular, or at least if it's not broadly popular, it's in the 40s, in the high 40s, right? So you would not expect Joe Biden to come out for defunding the police, or a lot of people who have to run in a purple state, a red state, in competitive districts. I listened to Ezra Klein interview Ta-Nehisi Coates on his podcast this week, and everyone should go listen. It's a fascinating and fantastic conversation. And he said, I don't expect Joe Biden to say defund the police, but I really hope that the people around Joe Biden are reading all the thoughtful takes about defunding police so that energy and those ideas bleed into his policy making in some way. That's what you can hope. So then the question is, how do the activists tell a story about defunding the police that becomes broadly popular? Anat Shanker-Osorio, who I had on The Wilderness, who's just an expert on messaging, she was tweeting about this weekend, and she said, sometimes we fall back on negative framing what we don't want, and we forget to tell sort of the positive side of the story. And it's not just, if we just talk about defunding the police and we don't talk about what we want to replace that with, sort of the positive things we're looking for, we kind of fall short. Data for Progress, our friends at Data for Progress did a poll over the weekend, and they tested, do you support or oppose a new agency of first responders, like emergency medical services of firefighters, to deal with issues related to addiction or mental illness that need to be remedied but do not need police? 68% of the people they asked support that kind of agency, which is the exact kind of agency that some of these cities, like Camden and possibly Minneapolis, might create to sort of supplement or to sort of shrink the role of traditional policing. So I do think it's incumbent on activists and all of us who want to see major structural police reforms to tell a story and paint a very clear vision of a world where our tax dollars are not funding police violence, but funding public safety that is equitably distributed to everyone in the community. That's what I would suggest. All right. So let's talk about how Trump's response to the last few weeks is affecting his bid for re-election. New CNN poll out today finds Trump losing to Biden 55-41, the biggest margin yet in Trump's lowest approval since the beginning of last year. Over the weekend, the New York Times reported that even some Republican Party leaders won't be voting for Trump in 2020, including their last two presidential nominees, Mitt Romney and George W. Bush. Times also reported that former Republican leaders like the former speakers Paul Ryan and John Boehner won't say how they'll vote, and some Republicans who, I know, I'm sorry Dan isn't on this episode because I know he's going to have something to say, and some Republicans who are already disinclined to support Mr. Trump are weighing whether to go beyond backing a third-party contender to openly endorse Mr. Biden. A number of military leaders who served in Republican administrations, including Trump's former defense secretary and chief of staff, have broken with the president in the last week. And over the weekend, former Secretary of State Colin Powell told Jake Tapper he'll be voting for Biden, saying this about Donald Trump.
And so we're not a country of just a president. We have a Congress. We have a Supreme Court. But most of all, we have the people of the United States, the ones who vote him in and the ones who vote him out. I couldn't vote for him in '96, and I certainly cannot in any way support President Trump this year.
So, yeah, I know you didn't vote for him in 2016. I assume, based on the fact that you approved Joe Biden when then Senator Obama picked him to be his running mate in 2008, I assume you're going to be voting for Joe Biden?
I'm very close to Joe Biden on a social matter and on a political matter. I've worked with him for 35, 40 years, and he is now the candidate, and I will be voting for him.
Tommy, Colin Powell is riding with Biden. How much does any of this matter? And do you think some of these endorsements or anti-endorsements carry more weight than others?
I mean, look, I think Paul Ryan refusing to say who he'll vote for is just it's worthless. It's pathetic. It's chef's kiss, Paul Ryan. I do think like George W. Bush, Mitt Romney, that's significant. I think General Mattis's broadside against Trump actually was pretty significant for a few reasons. I mean, first of all, like the DC pundit class reveres him like no other. So it got a ton of attention. It will continue to. Second, I think it will move opinions within the military itself and give others the courage to speak out. And that to me is what matters. Like, people in politics talk a lot about permission structures. If you see people who are in your party, who you respect, who you may have voted for previously, saying they can't go with Trump this time, they're going to go for Biden, I do think that helps you get permission internally to switch parties as well for a vote. I do find myself quite frustrated in some cases that it took this long. I think Trump's response to Charlottesville told you everything you needed to know about how racist and divisive he is. And so reading Mattis's comments about Trump recently, I felt like they could have been written the day after Charlottesville. But we're about building coalitions. We're about peeling off soft Trump voters. So this stuff could be incredibly meaningful on the margins. And I think you're seeing it in these polls. Like, everyone listening should know, as much as you hate Donald Trump, 55% of the country voting for any one human being is unheard of. Jesus Christ himself probably couldn't crack 54. So, like, we're in a weird reality right now. It's going to shrink, but it's a big deal.
Lovett, what do you think?
I wish Mattis would do it on television and stop doing it in the Atlantic. Like, this is a culture that doesn't read, so that doesn't do as much for me.
That's
like
what we were saying last week. Although the Lincoln
go on
Project,
television.
the Lincoln Project this morning finally
They
did a
job.
VO of his Atlantic piece. I was like, we need a good voiceover here.
And you know what? I'm glad Mitt Romney is out there saying Black Lives Matter. It's worth remembering that we have one Republican saying Black Lives Matter. We have many more saying how much Trump worries them in private, and then we have the vast majority standing behind him. I would like to see Mitt Romney not be so cute and write in Anne's name. You know, this is a choice. We have a choice. Do you want to be part of? Do you want to help us make this choice or not? I'm not interested in Republicans who write in other people's name. It's evading responsibility, not taking responsibility. And so, like, I'm not gonna give people points for doing less than the bare minimum of helping to remove Donald Trump, because there's only one person that you can vote for to help remove Donald Trump. That said, I think it's a good thing. I am very reluctant to start saying something feels different. Something feels different. Is this the end? Is this the end? It's prognostication. It doesn't matter. We still have to all do our job. And B, we've seen versions of this in the past. It hasn't been the end for Trump yet. He's not ended. And there have been many times where it seemed like the end was around the corner. We can remove him in November. These, I think, are good and hopeful signs. And I just want to know that this wasn't a nadir and a low point from which Trump slowly crawled back, and actually the beginning of the actual end.
Yeah, I think good for Mitt Romney, and it doesn't, we were talking about this earlier, it doesn't like negate all the bad positions Romney has taken throughout the course of his life, or all the things he's said that we've disagreed with over the course of his life. Like, people can change, they can grow, and then sometimes they can do things that are bad, and sometimes they can do things that are good. Like, there's like a raging debate about this. I don't think it's that complicated to me. I give Mitt Romney a little extra credit because he is the one Republican who voted to impeach the president when he had a chance. So he actually took an action that meant something as well. I do agree, Lovett, that the writing in the third party or writing in the name thing, I get why they're doing it, but like, what we're trying to send a signal to voters, many of whom in 2016 may have helped cost Hillary the election by either leaving the presidential thing blank on their ballot, voting for a third party, whether it was, the Greens or whether it was the Libertarians or whatever. And we want to send the message to everyone that if you want Donald Trump out of office, it is a choice between two people. And so to the extent that leaders let everyone know that it's a choice between two people, I think that's important. I'm with Tommy that it's all about a permission structure. I think there's two kinds of swing voters in this election. There's people who are like, you get a lot of college-educated white males who, they voted for Trump in 2016. A lot of them voted for Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan in 2018, or Tony Evers in Wisconsin in 2018, and they're still not sure if they're going to vote for Joe Biden. And I think for those voters, seeing military leaders, seeing Republicans say it's okay to vote for Joe Biden could actually have an influence. There's a whole bunch of other voters who don't know if they're going to participate in the political process at all because they think institutions have fucked them over for their whole lives and they don't trust them. I don't think George W. Bush or Mitt Romney is going to mean much to them.
This is not for them. This is not for them.
Not all swing voters have the same beliefs and values. Not all swing voters are going to be motivated by the same thing.
Yeah, look, I think Mitt Romney deserves credit for marching. I think he deserves credit for voting for impeachment. It's also just worth remembering that Mitt Romney's dad, George Romney, marched in favor of civil rights in the late 60s. Nixon tapped George Romney to run HUD and basically drove him out of the administration because George Romney refused to stop enforcing fair housing laws. So, I think he has a history of this kind of activism in his family. It doesn't mean I regret kicking his ass in the 2012 election. I find all this chatter on Twitter that he was horribly mistreated to be a touch overstated. It was a presidential campaign. I don't remember the Romney campaign. I don't remember the Romney campaign putting on a pair of white gloves and showing up at the boxing match. It was a fight. There was a political fight. Yeah, I remember. I remember sitting in my office in the NSC and reading a blistering press release from the Romney campaign on the night of the Benghazi attacks. As there's still like massive protests outside of embassies and feeling like that was a touch outrageous. But here we are. I want to focus on the current, and good for him for these votes. I don't. I'm ready to. I want to fight old wounds. That's what I want to do.
It's just worth noting, as one of you just did, about like the weird times we're in politically, that like we may go forward in November with a coalition that includes Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders and George W. Bush and Mitt Romney. Like, what the fuck is happening right now? That is a big, rowdy, very diverse, crazily weird coalition of people.
And listen,
who are gonna be voting in the
I'm just gonna say this too. All right, right here, right now. All right, George W. Bush maybe puts out an ad saying he supports Joe Biden, and we don't say much about it. All right, the day after that election, we're back to saying fuck George W. Bush. But I'm not doing it now. But fuck George W. Bush. Just between us, I'm saying it really quiet. Fuck him.
We've talked before about how the one political strength that's keeping Trump in the race is that voters tend to trust him over Biden on managing the economy. The president clearly thought he could build on this advantage last Friday when we received a better-than-expected jobs report. Economists had predicted unemployment would rise to 20% in May, but instead it fell to 13.3%, and we added 2.5 million jobs. During a speech in the Rose Garden, Trump celebrated this news and said the following.
Hopefully George is looking down right now and saying there's a great thing that's happening for our country. There's a great day for him. It's a great day for everybody. This is a great day for everybody. This is a great day in terms of equality.
That fucking guy, man. Let's start with the numbers themselves. Tommy, what are economists saying about why they were better than expected?
Listen, hold on. Let me just find my notes on this. So, John, I just want our readers to know that we don't have listeners to know that I barely understand this. People are talking about how there was a misclassification error in the BLS data, which means the unemployment rate would have been about 3% higher, so about 16.3%. Some people who were classified as temporarily unemployed were misclassified as absent, like you would be on, say, jury duty. I don't really care about fighting about that. It was a big Twitter dust up on Friday that I did my best to mute, but I do think, like, big picture, like, people are still suffering a lot. I think the Republican Party is going to create massive problems for itself if they use this job report as an excuse for not doing more to help people who are hurting as a result of the pandemic. So that's kind of like the Democratic eye on the prize here versus, unskew the BLS or whatever the debate was on Friday.
Yeah, love it. Controversial, out there political opinion. You tell me what you think. You shouldn't celebrate. You shouldn't celebrate double-digit unemployment.
No, look, I remember, John, you remember years in the White House. Years.
You and me, man.
Years. Any good jobs report, you had to go and get a chain, and you had to make sure that you hit yourself back on the back 5 times, 10 times, that to make sure you understood inside of the speech that even though you were pointing to progress on the economy, how hard things were for many people. And I'm being glib about it, but it was taken as an article of faith, backed up by polling, backed up by evidence, that President Barack Obama, did not want to be out there celebrating these numbers, which were far lower and better than the current numbers Trump is celebrating, for fear that it would seem out of touch and unable to relate to the real pain that people are feeling, in part because anytime Barack Obama said anything approaching what Donald Trump has been saying, he would have been pilloried. He would have been mocked mercilessly by Republicans claiming he was out of touch. So I continue to believe that is good politics, and that, Larry Kudlow in his fucking
we have a clip.
Oh, play the clip.
Let's play the clip of Larry. This is how Larry Kudlow responded to the news.
America is coming back. 3 million new jobs, lower unemployment rate, furloughed, temporary layoffs, going back to work, green shoots popping up everywhere, stocks are soaring, POTUS policies are working. Stay with the winners, Trump and Pence and me. The best is yet to come.
Wow. It's hard for you to hear. It's hard for you to hear in the audio, but the pinstripes on his suit are made of cocaine. The Kudlow, a green room creature, in his wide lapelled shirt and jacket, out there saying that everything is okay. It's preposterous. And this little debate about whether the unemployment rate is 13% or 16%, like, these are some of the worst jobs numbers in history, in a century. There's no getting around it. There's no talking their way out of it. They can't get past it. He's in crisis. And sorry, Tommy, go on.
No. But look, the flip side of your point, the flip side of my original point, is that Trump taught me that economic sentiment and how you feel about the economy is totally partisan, right? I mean, like, the economy had barely changed. Donald Trump becomes president, and suddenly a bunch of Republicans feel great about the economy because Trump is now in charge. So that irrationality behind that voter sentiment was surprising to me. Maybe that was naive. Maybe I'm an idiot. Maybe I'm going to get well actually off of all social media. But, like, that was shocking to me because you guys are right. We like Lovett said, like, every Barack Obama statement was as hedged and measured as possible about a good jobs report, in part because the underlying data suggested that people still weren't feeling things being better in their own lives.
So I'll just add one small point, which is Tommy's right that there is partisanship in terms of how the economy is viewed, but it actually isn't total. There's data on this, and it shows that when your party is in charge, you are more likely to say the economy is doing well. Right. That's true of Democrats and Republicans. It is just more true of Republicans, they are more likely to take a partisan view. But it's not total. Reality still exists. That's all.
So I completely agree. I think that polarization now, because it's so extreme, takes care of about 90% of what Tommy's talking about. I think there were always this segment of voters, and we saw this popping up in our own polling and other people's polls, that, like, the only thing that's keeping Trump alive is people who disapprove of his job as president, but they think he's good on the economy and they might approve on the economy. So I think for those people, you need to message this the right way. What would have made me nervous from a political standpoint is if Trump came out, I can't really imagine him doing this, but said, like, look, this is better than expected, but we have so much more work to do to bring this economy back, and I'm going to be fighting for a new package in Congress and all this kind of stuff. That would have made me nervous because it would have looked like he's fighting for people. Instead, it was a big fucking celebration. Republicans in Congress are like, all right, now we can pump the brakes on the next stimulus package. Trump is like, oh, I'm going to ask for more, but I'm going to ask for a payroll tax cut, which no one really wants.
Right.
And I think it is what he did right there. It was a huge political opportunity for Democrats, because basically Trump has now decided he is running as the candidate of the status quo in an election where like record numbers of people think the country's on the wrong track. The virus is gone, the economy's back, nothing's wrong, whether there's no social unrest or racial, everything is fine. The great American comeback has begun. You know, keep America great, which I guess now, according to the Washington Post, they might ditch that slogan. They might need a new slogan because America doesn't seem that great to anyone right now.
They're buying whiteboards by the bulk over at the White House. So,
So, like, I think that is a huge risk for him. He got to run as a change candidate in 2016, and now he's running as the candidate of the status quo by, like, celebrating this. And I don't know. Look, he can try. You know, he's going to try to say already that, like, Joe Biden's been in Washington forever and he's ineffective. And, you know, he could get some traction with that message. But it's in Trump to celebrate everything and say everything is fine all the time. It's not in Trump to say like things are bad and I'm going to fix it while he's the president.
No,
and I think that's a real danger. He's incapable. So
He said that George fucking Floyd, jobs numbers. We just went right by it. The man is incapable of expressing anything other than the man is incapable of expressing any other emotion than celebration of himself. That's it. That's all he's got. He is without empathy. The job has done what it has done to every American president, which is take their worst qualities and make them worse. And that's what we've got. And it's been on display. That's all.
That is correct. Okay. When we come back, we'll have Tommy's interview with LA District Attorney candidate George Gascon. Lovett, how was the show this weekend?
We had a very good Love It or Leave It. I talked to Osita Wanevu from the New Republic, talked to DeRay. We talked about everything from defunding the police and police ambition. We talked about everything from defunding the police and the goals of defunding the police all the way to what police reforms can help right now. We listened to some protesters, made fun of Leah Michelle one time. That's it. That's the show.
Okay, we'll take it. Also, if you haven't yet adopted a swing state through votesaveamerica.com, it's not too late. We are still in awe that more than 16,000 of you joined us live for the first training session last week. Tommy, you were one of the special guests. You want to say a word about that?
I was. I have to say, you guys know me quite well. I'm not a person who tends to emote. It was like one of the most overwhelming things to see 16,000 people spend an hour on a Thursday night to get trained to be a digital organizer because they care this much about the country in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of the protests, with all that's going on. It was incredible. Please come be a part of it. You will feel good if you are involved in this election, and you will feel good if you're trained and participating, and there's a community of people who will be there with you in a time when we're also isolated. So check it out. It was incredible. I can't wait to do it again.
I'll be the special guest at the training that we're having this Thursday, which is all about storytelling for organizers. So check it out. Hope to see you there.